We'll bring our first speakers on tonight. So in their book, Dr. Michelle Perro, MD, and Dr. Vincanne Adams, PhD, provide both insight and guidance, showing that in their combined experience, hard to diagnose and hard to treat chronic health problems in children are rooted in diet and environment. Dr. Michelle Perro is a veteran pediatrician with over 35 years of experience in acute and integrative medicine. More than 10 years ago, Dr. Perro transformed her clinical practice to include pesticide and health advocacy. She has both directed and worked as attending physician from New York's Metropolitan Hospital to UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital, Oakland. Dr. Perro has managed her own business, Down to Earth Pediatrics. She is currently lecturing and consulting as well as working with Gordon Medical Associates, an integrative health center in Northern California. Dr. Vincanne Adams, PhD, is a professor and vice chair of medical anthropology in the Department of Anthropology, History, and Social Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. Dr. Adams has previously published 6 books on the social dynamics of health, scientific knowledge, and politics, including most recently, Markets of Sorrow, Labors of Faith, New Orleans in the Wake of Katrina, and Metrics. What Counts in Global Health as well. She is currently editor for Medical Anthropology Quarterly, the flagship journal for the Society for Medical Anthropology of the American Anthropological Association. Please welcome Dr. Perro and Dr. Adams.
Thank you all for coming. I'm Michelle, that's Vincanne, and glad we can get started on this topic of what's making our children sick. And as you heard, I've been at this for a long time, and after almost, I think, 4 decades, you think I might get it right by now. I have a better understanding of it. And so the first question that we're often asked is, this marriage between a pediatrician and a medical anthropologist, how the heck did that happen? And fortunately, I could always usually say serendipity. And serendipity has been my friend throughout my life because many things that have happened from my understanding of this problem that we're going to be addressing this evening has been through sheer luck. So when I say that, how did I ever get into this world of GMOs and pesticides? Well, for so many integrative practitioners, and I call myself an integrative practitioner, you might have heard of functional medicine, holistic practitioner. I never like to say alternative practitioner. No, no, no. I got here through my own children, and my son was now 24, and he's healthy and doing well. But 24 years ago, not so healthy, and he had some health challenges. And I had the, yet again, serendipitous encounter with an MD homeopath, Dr. Ikenze in San Anselmo, and she's a wonderful practitioner. And she told me what to do homeopathically for my son. And dare I say homeopathically in this crowd, as some of you may know, homeopathy is not well received in the medical community, the traditional Western medical community. It has certainly been a cornerstone of my practice. And lo and behold, my son got better from some chronic issues. And I thought, what the heck? I am a New Yorker. Skepticism runs in my blood. And I said, no way, these little sugar pills fix my son. Sure enough, did it again. And lo and behold, he got better again. Second, I didn't need a third time to be a charm. And I studied homeopathy. And over the years, I eventually transitioned into practicing more homeopathically. So what also then happened happened in about 2006. And I was asked by a mom in Marin County to help stop the spray against the light brown apple moth, which was to take place along the entire coast of Northern California. And they needed a doc. And they said, well, you will do, Michelle. And I was a busy mom. I had a busy practice, active soccer mom, PTA, my own practice. You know the drill, right? You've all been there. And as most good women would say, when you're super busy, sure, I'd be delighted to help. Absolutely. I've got tons of free time. And teeth gritted, I became an activist. Never thought I'd be an activist. Never wanted to be an activist. And they stopped the spray. One county got sprayed and the rest did not because of this group of cows hanging around in the kitchen drinking lots of coffee, organic coffee, of course. And so this one mom said to me, hey, Michelle, what do you think about GMOs? And this was in 2006, and quite frankly, I didn't even have an idea about GMOs. And I said, not much. Why should I? And Lisa, her name is Lisa, said, yes, you should read Jeffrey Smith's book, Seeds of Deception, and she shoved a copy of that book in my face. And when smart women speak, I listen. Gentlemen, I hope you're taking notes. I did listen to that mom, and I read that darn book, and lo and behold, through Jeffrey Smith's book, on page 16, I read about the work of Dr. Arpad Pusti, who has studied the effects of rats, which we'll get into this evening. And based on what I saw of his work, which I went and looked up, and what I was starting to witness in children, which was a rapid increase in chronically ill children, I had an aha moment. Light bulbs were popping off in my brain. I recognized some stuff from what he was doing in my own patients as well as my own kids, and I started to put the pieces together. I'm going to turn the mic over to my friend, Vincanne.
Thanks, Michelle. So I wanted to, first of all, thank you all for having us here. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I also wanted to say, I probably ended up doing this book with Michelle. I probably ended up as a medical anthropologist, in part because my father, who had me use acupuncture when I was just a teenager, which was a long time ago, before it was popular even, and believed in all kinds of alternative theories. And so for me, becoming a medical anthropologist was almost like staying home. So as a writer, I thought I would tell you a little bit about our book with some things that I prepared in writing, because I'm a writer. And I also wanted to read some selections from the book for you so you can get a flavor for what we're talking about. So about 5 years ago, I met Michelle Perro. We took walks, and she began to tell me about her integrative pediatric practice, how she was dealing with chronic health problems in children, an epidemic of them, she said. I was fascinated by the kind of medicine she was talking about, mentioning problems like dysbiosis and leaky gut, medical conditions that were far from mainstream. And yet, like many of the ailments she described, I had seen in my own children some of these problems, in friends and in students. She talked about food being a key to health. And honestly, the only other time I had heard that was with Tibetan medical doctors, who I had spent many years, 20 years at that point, studying and writing about. This topic was far from Tibetan medicine, but as an anthropologist with a keen interest in the health politics of our times and the predicaments that we've created around chronic disease, I thought, I'd like to write a book about what she's doing. So I was fascinated by what appeared to be a gap in our medical infrastructure over dealing with chronic ailments and the crisis that this presented to doctors. What kind of medicine was needed to deal with this huge problem among our children and in the wider public for whom chronic disorders had become, as she always said, the new normal? To be honest, I was initially quite skeptical of Michelle's prognosis on GM foods. Like most people, I thought that the science on GM foods was settled. They were safe, and it was only a fringe of conspiracy theorists who believed otherwise. When I started to look into the research, I became fascinated for a second time with the way that it seemed to cross-cut many of our common assumptions about how much we should trust the so-called scientific consensus. On the one hand, the no GMO story was similar to that of tobacco. On the other hand, it was being called the equivalent of science denialism or climate denialism. The science on GM foods was a complete rat's nest of conspiracy, lies, and contradictory truths that had totally colonized the airspace on this topic. So I thought, well, that would also make a really good book. So on one of our walks, I think I said to Michelle, you know, this would all make a great book. And she said, I've been wanting to write a book about this for years. And so we decided to join forces to tell the story of Michelle and her patients and her approach to GM foods, but also to the things that I was really interested in, that I had been doing for much of my life and my other work on medicine and the science politics of this situation. So now, what do we say in the book?
This is good exercise for us. And I'm just as up and down. It keeps my flow, my circulation going well. So what do we say? If you're going to hear a medical talk, you're going to hear some statistics. And so I'm an MD, and we do love stats. So I'm going to give you some statistics so you feel like you got your money's worth this evening, especially for the gentlemen in the room, because the gentlemen want stats. When I have parents come to my practice, the moms are okay if I just say, listen to me, it's going to get better, and dad say, show me data. So, data. 1 out of 2 American children now has a chronic disease. So if that doesn't shock you, then I don't know what will. But let's look at what kind of chronic diseases are we talking about. So common diseases like asthma now affects 1 in 8 white children, 1 in 6 African American children, and Latino children are all over the map because they're just lumped together. A Mexican American might be 1 in 6 to 1 in 8, and Puerto Rican children it's 1 in 5, or 20% of Puerto Rican children. So it's really, you got to take some of these statistics, you know, you have to kind of like dig deep a little bit. Let's look at issues regarding neurocognitive disorders, and that's things like autism. Everybody's heard of autism by now, autistic spectrum disorder, which is now affecting 1 in 43 kids, boys, when we wrote the book, 1 in 68 kids combined. But since the writing of the book, it's now 1 in 34 boys, 1 in 58 children combined since we've just written the book. So those stats are rapidly changing. And what I've looked in, when I look further to the autism stats, which is one of the things that horrifies me, it's an epidemic by definition, by the way. Epidemics are less than 1 in 100. So it's state by state, with New Jersey having the highest rate of autism. I have to do one dig to New Jersey. I'm from New York. Yes, New Jersey has the highest rate of autism, 1 in 34 kids. It's country by country, and the other countries out there aren't faring as well either. In some countries it's leveled off. In some countries it's not doing well, like in Hong Kong it's 1 in 34 kids. So it's really all over the map. Let's look at things like food allergies. Food allergies, the severe life-threatening ones, it's 1 in 13 kids. But the harder to diagnose food allergies, which we go into the book a lot, which are less severe but equally debilitating, might be as high as 40% of all children. And when I left my last practice at Sutter Health, of chronically ill children that I was seeing, I would say 95% of them had food allergies. So that's about food allergies. If we look at issues with sleep, and I always like sleep problems in kids, for example, because nothing will motivate a family more than a kid not sleeping to get them to make a change. Have any of you had kids who could not sleep? And how motivated were you to get them to sleep? Very motivated, correct? So that 2 out of 3 children under the age of 10 has dysomnia or a sleep disorder, and that's really disturbing. So let's look at some more things. Autoimmune disease, certainly on the rise. Cancer, it's a slower rise in children with cancer because cancers take a longer time to develop. And there is a rise. Over the past 50 years, it's marked 40% increase in cancers, with leukemias being number 1, brain tumors being number 2. So let's look at even mental health disorders, because in Western medicine, we cut the head off at the neck. You know, there are 2 separate divisions. And holistic medicine, we look at them together. Anxiety and depression are a rise in kids. About 40% of kids now have been diagnosed with a mental health disorder, with anxiety and depression being the highest, OCD, etc. So this is the lay of the land of our children's health, and this is what is disturbing us, that our kids are not the same. And these trends have been occurring more over the past 2 decades. And is there anybody here in this room who has not had a child, a grandchild, or a friend, a kid? I assume most of you know kids at least. I would say this crowd, yeah. Who has not been affected by a chronic health disorder? Can anybody raise their hand and say that they don't know a kid who has a chronic health disorder? There's nobody in the room, right? It's impossible, maybe a gentleman back here. So if you go into your kid or your grandkid's classroom, half the kids in that classroom will have health disorders and have special IEPs. That's what the modern American classroom looks like now. So you can imagine the effect on teachers. So this is a profound problem. Any educators in the room? No oh. Well, a couple of teachers. Okay, so you guys know what we're talking about. So these are the stats of what we're dealing with, and this is one of the things that has prompted Vincanne and I to get into this book, so we can share some of these things with you.
So it wasn't hard to see that Michelle was right about the epidemic. But, you know, as we went to write this book, our thought was, well, how are we going to connect the dots between the epidemic and the larger crisis of both medical failure and the politicized sciences around food, the causes that were beyond the clinic, so to speak? How could we tell a compelling and convincing story corralling all the evidence that was available? Well, first, we decided we would have to start with the patients. With Michelle's help, we met Willa, who had been on antibiotics 20 times before she was 2 years old, and was, when she was brought to Michelle's office for the first time, failing to thrive. We met Trevor, who was only 9 years old, but had been suffering from ulcerative colitis for years, whose doctor had told him it likely had nothing to do with his diet, and that he should eat more bland foods like white bread. We met Sean, who had eczema over most of his body, but whose doctor had said it was not serious and only offered stronger and stronger steroids. We met Sammy, who had been diagnosed with autism spectrum at 2, whose mother described her experience from the kind of memory that only trauma can inspire. She remembered clearly how her daughter had gone from speaking nearly full sentences like, "Mommy, look, it's Dora the Explorer," to being a flapping, frustrated 2-year-old who could barely utter the words da, da, da. Interview after interview, ailment after ailment, we met so many children who were being put on antipsychotics and antidepressants, analgesics, nothing more than Band-Aids, from doctors who had never considered how food or gut problems might play a role in their patients' ailments. And then they would explain how, after switching to organic foods under Michelle's care, their children had become significantly better. Even with other remedies, along with the food, including regular old medical drugs sometimes, moving to organic seemed to heal the gut, enabling other medicines to be digested in order to work, to reduce inflammation and restore a healthy microbiome. The stories were powerful and frightening, and you will find many of them in our book. But to make the case we try to make in our book, we also needed a way to connect these patient stories, as I said, to the bigger social problems. Problems that formed what we have called the perfect storm of a crisis for our health, our environment, and our future. So I'll read to you a little bit about that perfect storm. To some readers, the notion that we are eating foods that are making us sick seems somewhat far-fetched. After all, we live in a country that has the most proficient and prolific systems ever known for the production of foods. We have a broader variety in our food choices than any generation preceding us, and foods that are cleaner in the sense of being free from microbial pathogens than ever in history. On top of that, most middle-aged adults are likely to say that they ate a lot of bad foods even before something called organic existed, and that they are not that unhealthy. Yet, it is clear that our children are getting more and more food allergies, food sensitivities, and chronic health problems related to diet than ever before, and certainly more than we middle-aged adults did as kids. Is it possible that we are doing something wrong? Is it possible that all of these chronic problems in our kids are related to something so basic as food? We believe our children are getting sick with chronic ailments today because of the cataclysm of at least 3 things. 1, living in a toxic environment from chemical exposures rather than from microbial infections, making the foods we eat a source of disease. 2, outmoded models of clinical care and disease causation. And 3, a scientific community that is embattled when it comes to food health science. These ingredients create an uncomfortable brew. This is a terrain of conflict that results in poor health, frustrated patients and families, and conflicted medical professionals. We have, in other words, created a perfect storm for ourselves and our kids. So Michelle will tell you a little bit more about what we're going to do about it.
So you're hearing about this perfect storm, and so we kind of like start to look into, and I think looking at this crowd, many of you are already familiar with some of this language, and looking at gut health. And Vincanne and I spent a lot of time in the book going into 2 specific aspects of gut health, and that is leaky gut or intestinal permeability and dysbiosis, which is an imbalance of the microbiome of those organisms that inhabit your gut. So let's first look at a little bit of intestinal permeability. And as an integrative health practitioner, healing starts with the gut. And I don't even think I started to say that. I think Hippocrates said that 5,000 years ago, let food be thy medicine and not thy poison. That's Perro, 2018, added that last piece. So don't Google that. But so I'm going to start with intestinal permeability. When that last job I told you about that I left, to work on the book with Vincanne, was that about of those patients that I had seen in my office, and these are kids and their families, I see adults too, with chronic complex, hard to diagnose issues, and that's who my patients were. I'd say 95% of them had leaky gut. So what is leaky gut? So leaky gut is something I think most of us are experiencing, particularly those of us who are eating GMOs and their associated pesticides, because you don't eat one of them alone. You can eat a food with pesticides alone, but if you eat a GMO food, it has the associated pesticide with it. So that these junctions that occur between cells are no longer functional, and there are little proteins that modulate the opening and closing of the cells called zonulin, which aren't functioning well. And so what's happening is you're getting disruptions of the intestinal epithelial lining, that little cell layer, which is only one cell thick. And what's happening is that our foods, before they're incompletely broken down, like gluten and dairy, environmental toxicants, whatever in the environment, microbial offload and byproducts of various microbes are passing into the bloodstream before and inappropriately. Your immune system, the ever surveilling immune system, which is sitting right there on the other side, is seeing these as foreign invaders and is mounting an immune response. And that is in essence the definition of chronic inflammation. And so you have this low-grade chronic immune response happening because of this chronic intestinal leakiness that's happening in our children's guts. So that is one thing that's going on. So how do we know this? Number one, you can take a history. Number one, you could do an exam. And number two, there's lab data you can check as well to see and look for leakiness. You can either measure zonulin levels, you can do that in labs, and Western practitioners aren't doing this, or you can measure antibody responses, which are indirect measurements of gut leakiness. So I'm just throwing that in there are some of the tools that I use to actually diagnose this. Okay, so what is dysbiosis? This is another very common condition we're seeing. It's a massive problem, and dysbiosis is this imbalance of the microbiome. And so babies now, especially those babies born via C-section, which is about 1/3 of all babies, right here, I had a C-section, they don't acquire mom's normal vaginal flora. And mom's vaginal flora, they need that vaginal flora because that vaginal flora talks to the baby's immune system, particularly the thymus, to set up something called innate immunity, which is the beginning of the baby's immune system. So babies that are born by C-sections, their microbiome looks more like the surgeon or the room that they're born in. And it's through breastfeeding and breast milk that they actually can reacquire the microbes that they need to talk to their immune system. And if American politics has their way with it, breastfeeding is going to be outlawed in favor of formula. Do you all see that? My political rant for the day. I will stay clear of politics right now and keep this talk. Can I throw some politics in? No, I'm not. I'm not doing that today. I'm going to keep my blood pressure low. Wait, hold on, people. Okay, so that microbiome is key for a baby's immune system. Okay, so what happens to the baby's immune system? Well, there are different things that affect the baby's microbiome, like an antibiotic course. One dose of antibiotics can do it. And we're going to get into this more, or even glyphosate, which is the major pesticide, herbicide component in Roundup, which is an antibiotic. And so there are no human studies of the effect of this antibiotic herbicide on the human microbiome, but we are working on getting one. By the way, we're working on a study. I know, can you believe that? So most of the data that I've extrapolated is from chickens, cows, and pigs, and mostly chickens from a chicken study from Germany, from a gal named Monica Kruger. And I won't go into all the details of the study, but what she did find with this one amazing German vet, I don't know if she's a veterinarian, she's a researcher, but using veterinarians in Germany, were that these chickens fed glyphosate had die-off of the beneficial bacteria of lactobacilli and bifidobacteria, and they had propagation of the more pathogenic bacteria, particularly salmonella and clostridial species. Now, when I see something like that, how can I extrapolate chicken data into children? Well, I am a pediatrician. It's close, but it's not that close. But what I can tell you is this. When I look at the microbiome of children, and I look at their PCRs, and I look at children's microbiome, as particularly kids on autism spectrum have an overgrowth of Clostridia species. Well, is that the effect of glyphosate? I don't know. I remove glyphosate from their diet, and they do get better. So there has to be an understanding that when you remove these substances from kids' diets, they get better. I just want to kind of infuse some hope here. And Vincanne and I will end on a hopeful moment. There is hope. Kids get better when you change their diet. I just have to say that because I read all these rat studies of, different labs studying 20 rats or 30 chickens. And since I started doing this work in 2006, it's been 12 years. I've seen a few thousand children. And I'd have to say there is really no child that I've seen that I haven't changed their diet. I'd say all, and I'd say 90% of them get better. Oh, that's just anecdote. I'm sorry. That's not real science, right? Oh, all right. I'm a clinician. So I'm just saying that this is real life situation. The kids in the book do get better, and Vincanne and I talk about them, and just to let you know that. So I think what I'm going to do is pass the mic now and stop beating you up with this stuff, and you can read more about it afterwards.
I'll beat them up with more stuff. Okay, so, it's true. Our kids are likely getting sick. Actually, they're probably getting sick for a lot of reasons, right? We know that exposure to chemicals and endocrine disrupting toxicants, PCBs, phthalates, parabens, these are all, in the built environment, in the products that we use, our beauty products, our cleaning products. These are also important. We don't discount these. But we hone in on the one thing in the book that seems to be the most overlooked, yet is likely the most potent source of both health and disease, that is food, right? Specifically, we focus on the problem of modern food. What happened to our food system? What changed? Why is food now a problem? Modern industrial food, let's call it. Chief among the industrial foods are the genetically modified or genetically engineered foods. Here come the talking points. I'll point them out to you when I say them. Okay, these foods were introduced to our food supply in the mid-1990s. Okay, so that's my kids' generation. Most of us have heard the argument that these foods are no different from what we would get through selective cultivation, hybridization, and cross-pollination, right? That's what you hear. And you also hear that these technologies have actually reduced the need for pesticides, and that we would not be able to feed the world without them, right? In our book, we explain why none of those things is actually true. In the book, we focus on two types of GM foods, which are the most prevalent. The first are the Roundup-ready crops. The most prolific of these GM crops today are Roundup-ready crops. These are crops that are genetically designed to withstand exposure to the active ingredient in the herbicide Roundup, or glyphosate. Okay, so some of you know this already. How does glyphosate work? Glyphosate kills all non-Roundup-ready plants by disrupting something called the shikimate pathway, which is needed for the plant's production of its amino acids. Initially, scientists assumed that glyphosate would not affect humans because human cells don't use the shikimate pathway. However, we now know that our microbes in our microbiome do have the shikimate pathway, and they are very much affected by this chemical. We now have a growing body of evidence, which Michelle's going to return to, that shows how these kinds of impacts are happening on the gut and in the body of animals exposed to glyphosate. And we also will say that, and we note in the book, the numbers have gone up since we wrote the book. We have seen an increase in nearly 300-fold use of glyphosate in the last decade alone in this country. The second type of GM technology that we focus on in the book is something called BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a naturally occurring bacterial toxicant that kills insects. BT crops are genetically modified to contain the BT protein that kills insect pests. How? By essentially punching holes in the lining of the insect guts and allowing the insect to die of a form of septicemia. Here, too, initially the assumption was that the low pH of the human gut would not allow the activation of the protein that killed insects with high pH guts. But we now know that these BT proteins are pre-activated in the crops, meaning they may have an active impact, similar impact on human guts. While BT technology did initially reduce the need for insecticides like DDT, over time and with the rapid growth of resistant insects, we must now use more potent pesticides than ever. Worse is the story of weed resistance, which has created a virtual arms race against of increased use of both Roundup and more genetically modified plants, modifications that enable plants to withstand the spraying of even more toxic pesticides, such as 2,4-D, which is an ingredient once used in Agent Orange, and something called dicamba. In other words, The GE foods that we focus on are those that have been genetically altered to be, here's the talking point, grown. They've been genetically modified to be grown with pesticides or to be foods that have been turned into pesticides in their own right. Somewhere around 90% of our commodity crops in the US are both BT and Roundup Ready. The important ones are soy, corn, canola, sugar beets, and cotton. Cotton we don't eat, but we spray a lot of Roundup on it. We also spray a lot of Roundup on wheat, even though wheat is not genetically modified. Or at least they're testing it. It hasn't been put into production yet. GM, genetic modification, is used in animal feed, however, alfalfa, and in growth hormones used in livestock. Other genetic modifications are found in many other vegetables and fruits, from squash, apples, and papayas, bananas to salmon and rice. These are the so-called enhancement crops. They constitute 1% of all genetic modifications. So when people say we wouldn't have any fruits and vegetables without them, remember it's only 1% of the genetic modifications are in that category. In the book, we go into the history of opposition and obfuscation of the truth on these things. We remind readers that we've never tested these foods on humans, only on animals, and that's a very small amount of study. We talk about the history of attacks on scientists who have done research showing the harms of these foods, and the nasty debates about truth. We also provide a good review of the evidence that is currently available that these foods are, and technologies are, harmful to health. And I want to say that the rationale for us writing this book was, well, partly because Michelle is who she is and does what she does, and no one else was doing this the way she was. But we have a lot of books about the harms of GM foods on farming communities and the sort of incredible disaster that that's created, especially for people in under-resourced countries outside of the US. But we don't have any books that make the connections between these foods and our health. And so we haven't had anybody make the links between the studies in the animals and what's happening in the human population. And that was the reason we wrote the book. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Michelle, who's going to talk a little bit about the evidence.
So like you guys, you're probably wondering, well, is it the GMO process? Is it the pesticide that's causing the problem, or is both? This is the question I ask. Is it the GMO process? Let's look at that. Is it the GMO process that's bad in those foods if we just take out and weave out the pesticides? And I looked at that question too. And I want to refer you back to that scientist who I briefly mentioned earlier, Dr. Arpad Pusztai, because that's where my little world flipped around after seeing his work. And Dr. Arpad Pusztai is a Hungarian researcher at the Road Institute, and in the 90s he was asked to look at whether GMOs were safe before they were introduced into the UK. And being a very meticulous plant biologist, it took him 3 years to formulate the study, and he did some research feeding a group of rats GMO potatoes, essentially, and non-GMO potatoes. Dr. Pusztai didn't think there would be any problem with the rats, and he thought that GM process would be just fine, just so you should know. What he found was very interesting, and it surprised him. And what he found was that GMO rats had disruptions in the intestinal lining. Those little villus projections that make up your intestinal lining were altered. And if you even go to Google Images and look up Dr. Pusztai's slides, you'll see the disruption of the intestinal lining. And it's when I saw that slide that I had that aha moment, you know, when the light bulb flips, it flips on, that I said, oh my goodness, could that be causing leaky gut? Could GMOs actually be responsible for leaky gut? Because I saw those disruptions. They're undeniable. They're very clear. Yes, they're histopathologic slides, but you can look at it and see the changes compared to the other rats who were not fed GMO potatoes. Then he also looked at the stomach lining, and what he found was very interesting, particularly for practitioners. He found that there was increased cell growth of the stomach lining called hyperplasia, which is the precursor to dysplasia, which is the precursor to cancer. And we now know that glyphosate, indeed, but this is glyphosate, it's been labeled a 2A carcinogen, but I also believe that the GMO process causes immune system changes, and that's what he found as well, that there were immunological changes in those rats fed the GMOs. He also, Dr. Pusztai also found other things. He found changes in organ sizes and weights and atrophy of various organs, enlargement of others, and he also, I mean, this is incredible what he found, in changes in kidney and liver function. And that's what Dr. Pusztai wrote about. Dr. Pusztai came out, he did a thing on BBC. He was a hero for 2 days, and then that call came from Missouri to Bill, to Tony, to his institute. His lab got shut down. He was fired on the spot. He went on to have a heart attack. This is not a HIPAA violation. He tells his own story in a movie called Scientist Under Attack. And then he came out later with the truth because he was silenced. And as Vincanne has already mentioned, there have been many scientists who have expressed concern about this genetic modification process that have been silenced and shut down. One right here in Berkeley, Dr. Ignacio Chapella. There have been many, Dr. Seralini in France, Dr. Judy Carmen in Australia, on and on. There have been many. So that was work now 20 years ago. And you're going to say, come on, Michelle, that work's outdated. Oh, well, let's go fast forward 20 years later to the work of Dr. Michael Antonio, friend and colleague. He's the head of gene expression and gene therapy in King's College in London. And Michael and his group did a very nice study using cutting-edge technology called metabolomics, looking at to see the genetic modification process and whether the GM foods were equivalent to non-GM foods, and he looked at rats. And what he found that they are not equivalent, that the GMO foods, GM or GMO, those are equivalent terms, cause oxidative stress on the livers. He also found changes in various chemicals in the body called polyamines, and he found increased levels of polyamines, particularly cadaverine and putrescine. I love those names. I just like saying those names. And these polyamines, which we have ubiquitously in our body, in high levels can be tumor-producing. Can that be linked to the increased rate of cancer? Possibly. Has it been studied? In humans, it has not. So we can see now that, and so there have been some researchers in between, Dr. Antonio and Dr. Pusti, Dr. Seralini, Dr. Judy Carmen and Howard Vlieger, Belinda Martineau out of UC Davis. So there have been other researchers looking at the GM process, but not that many. Well, why is that? Well, it's hard to get the seeds, number one, and most of the work is coming to Europe. We're not allowed to study it so much here in the US. Most of the work that we've depended on our colleagues, our European colleagues. So that's the GM process. Well, what about the Roundup? You know, what about, is that a problem? Well, let's go back to Dr. Michael Antonio's lab. He looked at really small doses of Roundup, 2 parts per billion. And I said, Michael, is that homeopathic? And he said, yes. I said, oh, vindicated. Yes, so those are very low doses of Roundup. He studied 2 parts per billion in rats. We're eating way more than 2 parts per billion of Roundup. It's really hard to not eat any of that stuff. I'm pretty crunchy as they come. I'm from Fairfax, and I can't stay all organic. It's really hard, okay? So what Michael found, 2 parts per billion Roundup in those rats, he found that there were changes in the liver called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And this is cause, not correlation, but causation of this problem. Well, what's a problem with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease? Well, lo and behold, it's affecting 1 in 4 Americans, according to the National American Liver Association. And it leads to something called NASH, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, which can lead to cirrhosis. We now have this massive problem of liver disorders in Americans. What about children? We wrote the book about kids. Yeah. No one's looking at it in kids except one Italian study, which I found, where they were looking at it only in obese kids, and those obese kids had a high level already, 1/3 of them, of NASH, which is the second problem after the fatty liver. And you really don't want a fatty liver. I'm going to tell you that right now. It's reversible. NASH, not as much. If you have a fatty liver, you can reverse your fatty liver. Well, you can stop eating pesticides. So you can see what we've learned is dose does not make the poison. Small doses of Roundup are problematic. The GM process is problematic. And when they're put together, when you eat the food with the GM process and the Roundup, according to Dr. Seralini, it's even more toxic.
So there are all these pathways, and we can talk about it more afterward, probably around gut erosion, dysbiosis, leaky gut, and then more direct effects on things like livers. So we like to end on a slightly positive note. We see the book that we wrote as a resource for those needing the argument and evidence to convince others. And a lot of people who have bought our book have actually talked about giving it to their doctors. Well, good luck with that. I don't know if it'll impact them. But anyway, in the book we do try to map out larger pathways for societal action. First, we talk about this group of people we call the warrior moms who need support. These are the moms who are out there fighting the good fight to keep their kids healthy, sometimes against the naysaying of friends, community, and even family members. Who are these moms? These are moms like the mom the moms of kids like Sammy with autism spectrum. Sammy's mom, Therese, told us that the story of her several-year journey to find the right kind of doctor for her daughter with autism, and how, after working with Michelle and doing an entire overhaul on her daughter's health and food system, starting with organic food, reported the story of how at her daughter's summer camp, when some new friends watching the kids told her that they were shocked to hear Sammy even had autism. She seemed so normal. We hear stories from Helen, mother to Sylvie, who described her meticulous efforts to keep her daughter healthy, carefully crafting all play dates, school lunches, visits with indulgent grandparents, so as to avoid chances that her daughter would eat or be fed foods that made her sick. Moms like these had had to go beyond their family and friends to change the whole food environment in which their children lived. Some had even started grassroots social movements and mobilized huge political action in order to clean up the food supply. So they get a whole chapter in our book. Second, we talk about the need to move beyond what Andrew Kimbrell at the Center for Food Safety calls the zombie paradigm in agriculture, in which we have created a collapsing ecosystem of depleted soils, depleted plants, and hyperdependency on ever more harmful chemicals and fertilizers. There is growing evidence that GM crops have outlived their fiscal benefits already, as farmers must pay more and more for the supplements they need to grow these foods. That's talking point 2. Making large agrochemical companies their competitors instead of their collaborators. We note that the largest agrochemical companies are sutured not just to agriculture, but to pharmaceutical research. Note the recent merger of Bayer and Monsanto. So Monsanto is no longer in existence, it's just Bayer, and you notice the ads that are coming out now on television from Bayer. So we can imagine the double dipping that will emerge as profits are made on both foods that destroy consumers' guts and the medicines that are needed to heal them. Finally, we talk about the need to work with what we call the reluctant constituencies. Mainly, I would say these are the doctors and the scientists who have often neglected to take worries about food seriously and who may have joined a chorus of support for GM foods, not knowing the full story of their risks. We suspect that because many of these scientific and medical experts have relied on the revolutionary benefits of recombinant DNA technologies, and in biomedical research these are quite widespread and actually quite hopeful, but all of those things get tested on humans before they're put in the market. These constituencies are worried that we are now suggesting that we throw the baby out with the bathwater, which we are not. We are proposing more radical rethinking of our vision of health and medicine by way of the soil. Let me just read you a final part of this in the book. What we're saying here is that we need a type of medicine that understands how patients are part of a medico-environmental ecosystem, what we're calling eco-medicine. What is eco-medicine? The problems we identify require systemic change, changes throughout all the body's biological systems, our medical understanding, and health systems, and our food production systems simultaneously. What we are proposing is an approach that nurtures food ecosystems that simultaneously nurture healthy environments and healthy bodies. Whether we conceptualize this at the level of the soils and their multiple living species that are required to stay healthy, or at the level of the gut microbiome that also needs a plethora of healthy species to survive, the model is one that looks for symbiotic modes of engagement, where mutual sustainability is a requirement. Food becomes a message and messenger, diplomat and language, decoder and purveyor of options, derived from the relationships both outside and inside the body. We are proposing, or reinforcing for some of you, the idea that the limiting factor in health is our food environment. Our internal ecosystems are only going to be as healthy as our external environmental ecosystems. The provision of healthy, nutritious, and non-toxic food is thus, in a sense, a public health emergency. So now I will turn it over to Michelle, who will give you some tips from a clinical perspective about how you can keep yourself healthy in your homes.
I feel the energy just kind of going down in the room.
So, right, Dr. Doom and Dr. Gloom here, we like to end on a positive note because we have found that you can fix these things. And they are fixable because I would have not had a physician practice if some of my patients didn't actually get better, right? Don't go see her, you'll never get better. No, actually most of the patients got better. So how do we do that? Well, we have to balance the internal and external environments. You have to improve this around here and this around here. So let's talk about the external environment first, and I'll give you some simple tips that we have to do. And a lot of you guys probably know a lot of this. Coming to these lectures for all these years, you probably can give me a lecture or two. But I'll just say by reducing the toxic load. Our children are toxic. We are all toxic. So you must reduce the toxic load. How do we do that? By, well, the food obviously will go into, but by your personal care products. Have to be brought down to a minimum. The average woman in America uses 20 personal care products per day. Just saying. Number 2 is your cleaning products. Vinegar and water, white vinegar and water in my house. I mean, talk about cheap and baking soda. So the cleaning products. Taking your shoes off at the door because the most toxic thing in your home is house dust. My husband refuses to do it. So I just live in a sea of toxic dust in my house, but maybe in your house you can do this. So these are just some simple things you can do in addition to some type of water filter. I finally convinced my husband to get a reverse osmosis filter. That only took 22 years. Maybe some of you might be a little more successful. But if you can't afford that, because they're kind of expensive, a simple Brita or pure carbon filter water filter will also be better than drinking tap water, because I think more than Flint, Michigan, many of us have toxic water systems across the U.S. So these are some simple things you can do. In terms of the food and what we eat, I mean, if you don't get the message to eat organic after this talk, I'm not sure what's going to work. So yes, we have to eat organic. And people say, well, organic is more expensive. And it is. It is more expensive. Then what the heck do we do about that? Well, somebody's got to get back in the kitchen, and it ain't going to be Dinah. And I'm not just saying mom here, okay? That was 1968. We're past that. Everybody's got to get back in the kitchen. There's no reason why your children can't get in the kitchen too. They seem to be able to navigate any program on that computer. I bet they can do a little bit of cooking. I'm just saying. Right? And my kids too made that mistake, wouldn't make it again. So number 1, everybody's in the kitchen cooking, and when you actually cook and you buy in bulk, I did this for a daycare, Marin County. We came out under budget when we cooked and bought in bulk and bought organic than the processed stuff they were buying. And Costco, I have no stock in Costco. They are doing an amazing job. They have a ton of organic stuff right now. So it is possible to eat organic on a reduced budget. And so I'm a big fan of alkalinization and green juices. I don't do juice fans, but lots of greens and children's diet on your own. And you have to slowly introduce kids to the flavors of greens. And they're sweets are not a right. There's not a children's rite of passage that they must eat sweets. I don't know who came up with that there's some absolute requirement that kids get candy. Who thought of that and other sweet things? That is out. You just like erase that idea. So children do not need to be eating sweets. But you have to introduce the taste of vegetables because they're sharper. And kids have a sharper palate and more taste buds than adults. So it takes them at least 10 times to calibrate to a new food. So I usually introduce them with other foods like coconut milk or pineapple that children seem to like. And you slowly introduce greens that are alkalinizing, which are helpful. They can help you detox. Most of us, I said already, toxic using herbs like cilantro and parsley. And I have some in my water bottle in my car, a nice dose of cilantro that I almost drink every day. And this is another way to get this kind of stuff in. And probiotics. Now, it's expensive to buy probiotics, so what about fermented food? Hey, look, I'm no Martha Stewart here, and I work, but I did give everybody fermented sauerkraut for Christmas this year. Woohoo, because party at my house. And it actually was really well liked. That gift was a big find, and it wasn't very expensive to make that sauerkraut, and it's super healthy. And you can put that fermented juice in kids' foods and get them started that way, eating fermented foods. So these are just some simple things. Vincanne and I did not go into many treatments into the book. This is not really how to fix it. We're just laying the lay of the land of the problems. I have been thinking about writing a follow-up book, maybe with Vincanne, maybe not. She's gone on to another book herself. But anyone interested here in a treatment book, a do-it-yourself book at home, would you be interested in that? I'm curious. And by show of hands, should we do that? Yeah, how to do it yourself if you don't find a Dr. Perro. How to fix these things yourself at home with your own tools. Will you guys be interested in that? I wonder. Like, how do I do this? How do you do it? How do you do it at home? I would even put it online and make it like for a couple of bucks. You know, we're not going to retire on this. This is something that we're trying to get into the hands of every mom, every dad. We say moms a lot, but yo dad, you're in the equation. Grandparents. The kids shouldn't be going to grandparents' house and it's a sugar holiday. I'm just saying, like my in-laws. They go there and come home with like a bag of sweet goodies. Grandparents don't do that. And so this is sort of the thinking, is we need to get this book out there so that we can change our eating behaviors. And gals, I hate to say it, but a lot of it is on us because women spend 85% of the household budget. Oh yeah, we're spending the money, ladies. I know it's true in my house. The credit card bills are mostly mine. So you are what you spend, so we can shift, as I've heard Jeffrey Smith say many a time, it's an economic tipping point of where we put our money. So I think we're going to end on that note, and I don't know if we want to do Q&A, maybe now or later, or we can, however you like, but we'll have some Q&A session.
Thank you. So can we use this mic for them? Yeah, but they can pass it back and forth. Oh, they can. So let's see. How about I use this one then? Okay. Okay, so thank you. Let's give them a round of applause. And the floor is open for questions. So I'll try and get it in as close a order as I can see people raising their hands. But make sure you don't ask a question before you get the mic in your hand. Thank you.
You said something about glyphosate being an antibiotic, and I had heard that originally it was a descaling agent used on pipes that they only accidentally discovered killed plants, that it actually pulls minerals out of all the plants. They had to change the weight of a bushel of corn to sell corn because the corn that's grown now has so much less minerals that it weighs a lot less. So can you explain how it's an antibiotic? I understand how it pulls minerals out of the food and makes us deficient, and probably does that with our microbiome, but I don't understand how it's an antibiotic, and I'd love to know that.
Do you know the science of why it's an antibiotic?
Yeah, yeah.
It was a chelator when it began. Here,
Yeah.
you can use
Do you want me to use
this.
one?
Yeah.
It's a good question, and if I ever followed my notes, I would have covered that, but God forbid I should read what I write. So this is a good question. Glyphosate, that magical little compound that it is, N-phosphonyl-methylglycine, it's an amazing little thing, has glycine in it. It's an antibiotic by inhibiting the shikimate pathway that Vincanne was referring to. It's a pathway in our microbiome that they need to produce aromatic amino acids, to produce neurochemicals that run your brain. That's what inhibits that system of amino acid production that you need to make neurotransmitters. So that's how it's an antibiotic, by inhibiting the microbiome at the shikimate pathway. It kills the microbes. And so,
Vincanne, make sure you have a microphone if you're speaking.
Right, so I was just following up on what she was saying. This works, I think.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So I think what she was saying, that she skipped over kind of quickly, is that when it strips the cell's ability to produce its own amino acids, it kills the microbe itself. So that's antimicrobial. Yeah.
shikimate, shikimate, and we also talk about it in the book, shikimate pathway.
It's actually patented as an antibiotic.
So what Vincanne is saying is that Monsanto patented glyphosate as an antibiotic in 2000, and in 2010 the patent was granted, and it's a broad spectrum antibiotic to kill off malaria, protozoans, strep, staph. I actually read the patent. It's an amazing antibiotic. So it also chelates minerals, and that's what you're referring to. So what this young gal was referring to is the fact that glyphosate was originally brought out in the market as a metal cleaner to clean out pipes, and it binds minerals such as magnesium, calcium, zinc,
copper, manganese, and these are all minerals that you need in your body to run systems. They're cofactors in various enzymatic reactions in your bodies. When they saw that the weeds around the metal cleaner were dying, they said, oh, whoa, look at this, metal cleaner herbicide. Bro, this stuff is amazing. So it also, so that's what it does too. So kids and us who are also very deficient in nutrients, is it caused by the binding ability of glyphosate? Possibly. It's been studied in plants and in livestock, but not in humans. Glyphosate also, it inhibits a detox pathway in your body called the cytochrome P450 system. It also, that's what also thing it does. And it's, anyway, those are the main talking points.
And it'll kill humans, but it takes longer.
Yeah, it's the IARC, International Association for Research on Cancer, labeled it a probable carcinogen in relation to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And it's called a probable because it's only been shown in animals, hasn't been shown in humans yet.
You mentioned the question of distinguishing GMO issues versus the pesticide, and I didn't really hear that resolved. I mean, couldn't this all be caused by, well, the BT and the Roundup versus the GMO itself?
Right, so I'll start it and then Michelle can kick in. You know, there are lots of theories about why GM foods are bad, and one is that it's the process of injecting the creating the genetic modification in the plant itself. And that's what Arpad Pusztai argued, that it was actually the process of inserting the transgene. And then there are arguments that it's actually the genes that are produced, sometimes random genes in that process, that might be causing the problem. What we focused on mostly in the book, we talk about those a little bit, but we focused mostly on the evidence that's available that the pesticides are the problem. The mechanism that's designed in BT is also potentially a problem. There isn't as much data on that, although there are studies that show BT causes harm in animals.
Yeah, and so that the genetic modification process, when they insert this new gene, this desired trait, which is to resist dying when Roundup is sprayed, that's a desired trait. It's a pretty aggressive and random process where they insert the gene, can often be random. They have to do all kinds of things to the plant to get the plant to uptake the new gene. And what happens is, because of this new genetic sequence, which is not hybridization but a random genetic process, there are rogue proteins that are formed in addition to which they hadn't anticipated. These rogue proteins are what we feel is what's causing the massive rise in food allergies, are these rogue proteins. Belinda Martineau saw it when she created this flavor saver tomato. She is a geneticist from UC Davis. And we're seeing it again now in this production of the new Impossible Burger, which is a meatless burger that's been genetically engineered through CRISPR technology to bleed like meat. And there are 46 new novel proteins that we have never seen and our immune systems have never seen, that have already been showing the signs of early severe food allergies called anaphylaxis. So that is the genetic modification process. What some scientists have argued, like Dr. Seralini from the University of Caen in France, has found that when you couple that genetic modification process with Roundup, and Roundup is glyphosate plus inerts. The inerts are not so inert. Most of them are surfactants, which break down the fatty cell membranes and allow the glyphosate to enter the cell to become more toxic. So Dr. Seralini felt that indeed it was not just the GM process, it was plus the Roundup, and he was very concerned about the inerts in the Roundup and the glyphosate. So we have evidence of both. Dr. Judy Carman out of Adelaide in Australia, who's the big BT toxin researcher, has just put out a paper a week ago where she again showed that this BT toxin is causing massive stomach destruction in animals. And if you talk to veterinarians now, there's massive livestock die-off happening across America, where some farmers are reporting up to 25% of their livestock dying. And when they simply switch to a non-GMO diet, it solves the problems. It's pretty remarkable. I've seen livers of livestock, and then before and after switching to a GMO Roundup-free diet, and it's unbelievable.
And there was an article that just came out today, I think we both read it, about the collateral damage issue around CRISPR. is also now being raising concerns about it eliminating some of the protective anti-carcinogenic capacities of cells. So there's new stuff coming out all the time. You know, it's not, you know, we're not using CRISPR widely yet because there are a lot of concerns about it. And using it in plants is just going to go like wildfire. You know, they're already doing it, so.
The microphone is critical, so make sure you have it in your hand if you're asking questions. Thank you.
So a couple things. In the beginning, I don't know if they still do this, but they actually put an antibiotic-resistant gene in when they were doing the GMO process so that they could, and then they'd put an antibiotic in to see if they got it, see if it took the GMOing. So now you had an antibiotic in the genes also. So I don't know if they can stay in the genes exactly, but that was another level of problems. I was going to ask you about CRISPR, so I'm glad you said that. And the other thing is that they found that, I mean, if you look at the studies, the Russian studies, that the second generation mice were like half the size of a regular mouse. And so, I remember in Jeffrey Smith's Genetic Roulette, he said that the vets across the Midwest were going, not only were they dying, but they were, especially like small horses, the little pony type horses, were just like flat out dying because they already have slightly compromised systems. But the other thing was that the animals weren't reproducing normally, and that's part of the reason that there's reproductive problems in this country. So anyway, I don't know if you know about the antibiotic-resistant gene stuff. I'm not sure they're still doing it or not.
So I can also, I mean, I just want to come to the last part first, and then Vincanne, you could answer part of this too, is the infertility issue. I'm concerned about that infertility issue also. Probably 1 out of 12 people now are experiencing issues around fertility. I am happily involved with a website called gmoscience.org. I'm the executive director. We just put out an excellent article on fertility, infertility, and the link to pesticides based on a Midwestern study showing that women who had higher levels of pesticides had a higher rate of miscarriages and infertility. So that's one part there. I can answer the antibiotic question. Did you want to answer the antibiotic question? So when they have, what you're referring to by the antibiotic is when they were creating the insertion, the genetic insertion, they had a little terminal end piece of antibiotic that they inserted into the cell to get it to take, and they were using it to study. And in my understanding, as far as I know, they're still doing that. And if that is wrong, I will certainly let this group know through an email. My understanding is that they're still doing that.
I don't know. I haven't read anything about that, but I do know that if we're worried about antibiotic resistance and overuse of antibiotics in the system, we should look first at the use of it in livestock and in humans before we worry about that. I'm not sure that they're still using that technology. I think it was a test technology to get it so they could measure whether they had actually modified the gene, but I'm not sure it's still used, and certainly CRISPR I don't think uses it, so yeah. So, but really, the antibiotic resistance problem is huge, and it's mostly because of its overuse in humans, and of course, we're getting extra antibiotic resistance through the livestock use of it.
So, the idea that it's an antibiotic is just that it follows the pathway. That it's not an antibiotic for any particular thing, and we don't use it for pneumonia or hepatitis or something. It's just that it follows the pathway that an antibiotic would to destroy the microbiome. Is that right?
Right. It works as an antibiotic. It was never brought to market as an antibiotic, but it works as an antibiotic.
But that's a little bit confusing because it sounds like it has a purpose then to do something that an antibiotic might do, which it doesn't seem like it really does.
I think Monsanto thought they were going to be clever and market it as an antibiotic, yet there was one more thing that this magic glyphosate could do. But it was never brought to market as such as an antibiotic, but the patent is still out there and it still exists. You can Google it and there is still a patent by Monsanto with glyphosate as an antibiotic.
But nobody would use it
if
they needed an antibiotic.
No, nobody's used it. Not to my knowledge, no one's used it as an antibiotic.
Okay.
But, you know, there are good studies of just random samplings of glyphosate levels in humans in the U.S. in particular, in various states, and they're all very high. So, you know, we're all getting a lot of glyphosate. So there's a constant, you know, consumption of a certain antibiotic is what's going on. That's
Well-
why we're talking about leaky gut as one of the
Yeah.
outcomes of having a lot of things going on in our
random
gut. Yeah.
rogue proteins
And dysbiosis.
roaming around.
Not rogue proteins, antibiotics.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
it just, oh God, I forgot what I was gonna say. Okay, I forgot.
Just right next to you.
So you presented a wealth of information, things that I have not read in the mainstream media. How would the general public, or how would the informed, the interested public keep up with the literature on GMO and antibiotics and stuff?
First, they can read the book.
Read the book. So, I think this is a good question. And Bill, thank you for that question. There are some really good websites out there. And I already said ours, but I think there are other ones too that you should be aware of that really put out good information. One is GM Watch. And that is an excellent source of updated information. The other one, if you want more of the political view of people right here in the Bay Area, is US Right to Know. An excellent source of information. 3 hard-hitting people run that. One in particular is Carrie Gillum, who just wrote a book called Whitewash, and which he really goes through the entire obfuscation and collusion by Monsanto, Syngenta, Dow, etc. I think I'll give you one more website, GMO Free USA. That's Diana Reeves.
.com or .org?
If you GMO Free USA, Diana Reeves is .org. And in the back of the book, we have a resource center with a lot of these websites. And for those of you with more activist potential, Moms Across America, run by Zen Honeycutt. And she has a lot of stuff that's more parent-oriented. And she has a great website as well.
It's GMO Free California, actually. GMOFreeCA.org.
GMO Free California. No, I think it's changed since then. I think if you just Google GMO Free USA is what Diana calls it now. I know we had California the book, but I think she's changed it since. This stuff is constantly evolving since even the book was published and came out in November. it's constantly. So I think, and lastly, don't forget to check out Environmental Working Group. I think they have some good lists, for example, on things on everything from water filters and the Dirty Dozen, the Dirty 15. And also don't forget the past videos on Silicon Valley Health Institute's website. Amazing, since 2004, of speakers of tremendous caliber, I guess we're in there now, who have been reporting on these subjects for many years.
I just wanted to make one mention of GMO Myths and Truths. Oh, yeah. By Claire Robinson, Michael Antonio, and John Fagan. It's a Bible for people who are interested in the current science, and they've just updated it, and it is available online. So it's a very good resource.
And there's so many. And Jeffrey Smith has just put out an amazing series going on right now. I spoke yesterday on that one, on GMOs Revealed, on how to treat the side effects of GMOs and pesticides. It's called GMOs Revealed, Jeffrey Smith. He has 2 amazing books, Seeds of Deception, Genetic Roulette, 2 movies, Genetic Roulette, and Secret Ingredients, made with this fabulous producer, Amy Hart. So Jeffrey Smith has a wonderful website called Institute for Responsible Technology that is just filled with resources, PowerPoints, ways to get involved, and he really does. He's been a crusader in this movement for over 20 years, and he's a good friend and colleague. So I would say Jeffrey is one of my go-to guys, and he lives in our town, so it's easy to track him down at our local health food store.
So when I said talking points, I guess I wasn't clear. I need simple and basic, basically not for a man who wants statistics, for my adult daughter who actually happens to be dating a lovely man who is an engineer at Impossible Foods and thinks GMOs are nothing and organic is not important and all the things that I think are really important, and tried to raise her, but I only had her half time because she was with her dad, who also doesn't think they matter. So I'm the woo-woo hippie mom, and she doesn't think that any of it is important. So I have to have simpler things. She doesn't want to hear statistics. She's going to not discount them. She doesn't want me to send her to studies. She won't read them. She won't read the book if I give it to her. I have to have somehow simple things to say that might like put a light bulb on to enlighten her, because I obviously care more about her and her life than anybody else even.
I would simply say that GMOs create foreign proteins that our bodies don't know, and they're linked to food allergies. I would say that you don't eat GMOs alone. You eat them with massive amounts of pesticides. And because of weed resistance, about 75% of weeds in America are now resistant to Roundup, that they're applying more and more pesticides and more toxic herbicides on these genetically modified plants. So we're getting increased doses of pesticides because of genetic modification. It has not reduced our need for pesticides, it has increased it. So there is no reason to eat chemicals. Chemicals do not enhance health in any way. So I would just stick to those points. If she's in the childbearing age, you can say that there's a higher rate of infertility in women who had higher pesticide levels. So if she eats GMO food, she will be eating higher pesticide levels. You can bring that one in.
I mean, it's a hard sell when her partner is making genetically modified food. But one other thing, it might be too complicated, but you know, it's interesting. One of the things that swayed me was learning that, in fact, none of these foods is being regulated by the FDA, so there aren't any fail-safe protections out there for foods, because the argument the industry has won is in convincing regulators that these foods are generally recognized as safe. They're the same, yeah. So even with the Impossible Burger, it's falling through the same regulatory gap. And we aren't actually testing it on humans, so we don't really know what the effects are going to be. And it's wheat-based. And it's wheat-based. Wheat isn't genetically modified in itself, but the wheat issue is a different, yeah, it's sprayed with Roundup.
But it's sprayed with glyphosate
yeah.
when they cut it down.
But that Impossible Burger does utilize a genetically modified yeast in there. And so it's not as millennial friendly as they tout it out to be. We have a good article on gmoscience.org about the Impossible Burger, if you want to share that with her.
How would I measure my own glyphosate load? And then how would I go about, is there a way to chelate it out or remove it versus, I mean, one approach obviously is to stop eating glyphosate, which you say is almost impossible. So how would you go about it?
So to test your own urine, there's a lab out of Iowa, Fairfield, Iowa, called Health Research Institute, HRI. And one of the people who runs that lab, John Fagan, was co-author of the book that Vincanne mentioned, GMO Myths and Truths. That test, you can order it yourself. You don't need a doctor's requisition, and it costs $99. And it will look for levels of glyphosate and its metabolite called AMPA. And so you can check your own glyphosate level. If you go organic, and mostly organic, in 2 weeks you will clear glyphosate from your urine, and if you're so inclined, you can recheck your urine. There are some products out there that are now designed to help you clear glyphosate. And they are, some of them are, you can get yourself. One is by a company called Supreme Nutrition. I have no stock in any of these companies. And they make a product that will help you clear glyphosate by Supreme Nutrition. The other one is by Sevene Pharma, S-E-V-E-N-E. And Sevene Pharma makes a homeopathic that was designed by Seralini and his lab that I have found very effective in clearing glyphosate. Now, having said that, there is a researcher in New Hampshire named Anthony Samsel. He's published a lot with a researcher from MIT named Stephanie Seneff. Anthony, off record, does not feel you can ever clear glyphosate once it enters certain parts of your body, such as your cartilage and your tendons, and it's in your nails and everything else. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I don't go biopsying people for their glyphosate levels. That's not what I'm doing. Well, maybe I should, but I haven't yet. So I say if you can clear it from your urine, you're doing pretty well. The bottom line is, how do you feel? When you change your diet from non-organic to an organic diet, do you feel better? Is your sleep better? Is your mood better? Is your gut better? Is your bloating better? Is your poop better? Are all those things better? How's your mental status? If those things are better, you're doing good. I've seen it take anywhere from 3 days to 4 weeks to feel better from switching from a non-organic to an organic diet. If you go mostly organic, you're going to be eating pretty much organic. You can avoid it. I mean, if you go mostly organic, and that's what you want to do.
Even if you don't feel better, you better do it. But the other thing is the labeling, which is coming out now, which they've done a horrible job of labeling now because they want to keep it a secret. So it's going to, things are going to say GE. I've looked at it, but I couldn't tell you what it is. But they're going to say GE. There may be like a code on that you have to use your cell phone to figure out. So just be aware that now they're starting to not label it GMO because people know what that means. They'll be labeling it GE or something or something more difficult to figure out, like a code that you have to scan. So, but corn, soy, canola. Beet sugar, Hawaiian papaya, those are the guys to stay away from. I mean, that's the main. Although, according to Jeffrey Smith, 172 plants have been genetically modified that they're waiting to try to get out there. They've got the McDonald's apple now that will not turn brown that's out there. So you have to keep looking. But watch the labeling, because it's very deceptive now, and they're trying to make it more and more obtuse, so you can't figure it out. I don't know if you guys have that in your book yet, but...
Yeah. So she's right. It's QVC labeling, and that's what Congress wanted to put out, and they are putting pretty little butterflies, and I think there's some nice little happy smile or something on, it's calling GE now, because the GMO word is so toxic. And everybody's avoiding that word. I think we're avoiding it too sometimes, and because it's such a charged word. So we use GE, but the QVC labeling, that means you need a PhD to go to a supermarket now to figure out what the heck you're eating. There are CRISPR foods out there. The Arctic apple is CRISPR. It's you can buy it on Amazon. We tweeted about it through Moms Advocating Sustainability. We tweeted about it, the Arctic apple, about their lack of transparency, and the Arctic apple quickly tweeted back that you can read all about their CRISPR apple on their website. But all they have on the Arctic apple on Amazon, where you can buy it, is a little R. You know that little R that says that it's patented? And there's no way you can figure out that that thing is CRISPR technology. That's the Arctic apple, which doesn't brown.
The R means registered.
Means registered, thank you. So it's a registered apple, but there's no way that you can figure out. So that's why you have to just try and eat as organic as you can. The only CRISPR foods I know that are out there now are the Impossible Burger. It's out. It's in some restaurants. The Arctic apple and the innate Simplot potato, which came out of Cornell.
Just look for the 9. That's the organic signal.
Does the organic mean non-GMO, or
once again?
does the organic mean non-GMO, or can we trust the label?
Yeah, organic generally means non-GMO. It definitely means non-GMO. It wouldn't get the label organic if it didn't. I will say that there's a lot of controversy and confusion around some of that as well. You know, there is a growing movement in the farming community around organic and the nutrient levels in organics and the kind of farming that allows nutrient levels to stay high versus not high. So some organics that are mass-produced are not as nutritive as others. That is true, and sometimes the processes that are used in some organics are kind of scary. And so one has to be a little bit careful about that. But anyway, you're not going to be getting the kind of pesticides that you would be getting with organochemically grown foods if you're eating organic.
So there are a lot of
it is
these,
safe.
even the Whole Foods, you know, like I mean, you get some of these organics, which is kind of like made in China, and you know.
Right. So that's
stuff.
it. There's a big industry in organics, and I will also say the other murkying factor here is even companies like Bayer and Monsanto are now going into the business of probiotics for the soil, which you can imagine they're doing in order to be able to claim that they're doing organic as well. So it's really, and that's genetically modified. So it's really murky. I mean, it's a kind of, and you're like, the critics, like, we're way behind already. They're already 10 steps ahead of us on all of this. I don't even think glyphosate's going to continue to be used within 10 years. They're going to have better, bigger, you know, modifications that are going to be out there. So it's a pretty big uphill battle. But it's a good starting point to say just organic. At least you're getting rid of some of the pesticides.
I came across some place that they were trying to remove the GMO free from organic, which there was some government website to comment on.
Yeah. Yes. So I read that too. You don't need to remove the GMO. Some things say organic and GMO free. If it's organic, it's GMO free. Yes. And so we're just going to have to keep our eye on the...
Not from the microphone.
There's a certain percentage that they have to allow for drift. It's a very, very small percentage. They have to allow. Right.
So what she's referring to is that, and I've spoken to our local grocer, Good Earth, about this many times, and that because crops are so contaminated that at least there's about a 5% contamination rate with organic crops. And so they're allowing about 5 to 6% in because it's in... No, not that small. It's actually higher, particularly with crops like corn, which can travel thousands of miles, that it's really hard. I think it's up to 5 to 6% according to Mark Squire, who owns the Good Earth. And so, but I would still say that you eat organic, you're way ahead of the curve. You're going to avoid GMOs, you're going to avoid pesticide, even if it's not as nutritious or high nutrient dense as regenerative farming, organic food. But for gosh sakes, we have to feed our families. We're working people, and I don't want to go make my supermarket trip a 3-hour adventure. I'd like to get in there, do my business, and move on with my day. So I'd say if you stick to organic, you're going to be doing much better overall, and I'd say keep it simple. I'm a kind of a simple gal. I just say keep it simple.
But I would also say that there are organic growers who don't have the label organic because they haven't gone through the process of getting it, even though they're and it's very expensive to do that. So it's a sort of farm-to-table endeavor to figure out how they're really growing their food and whether they're reliable. But you can get that food too, even though it's not called organic.
I just wanted to say one thing, and that is all the food on the table is organic except for the watermelon.
The watermelon.
Do you have a quick question?
I was just going to, the only thing I was going to say is there's a great deal of difference between the genetically modified pesticide or herbicide and spraying it. There is a difference, and they found that you can get much more easily rid of this pesticide that's been sprayed, but getting rid of the one that's in, I mean, I remember they used, Jeffrey Smith used to say that your gut could become a pesticide factory. That's how bad, that's how much the genetically modified stuff gets into your system. So if there's a little bit of pesticide or herbicide, it's not that big a deal, but it's the GM stuff. That's why even the drift and stuff is not as bad. There will be some GMO drift too, but it's not nearly as bad as eating genetically modified food. Also, you got to watch out for the zucchini, some zucchini and yellow squash. So if it's not organic, don't eat it.
I mean, Jeffrey's
ones.
a great activist, and there also is really good science out there available on some of this stuff. That's, for example, in the GM Myths and Truths book, that will track some of that in a slightly more scientific way. There's a question over here. Oh, she's been waiting a long time for. Okay.
I was wondering what kind of, if you did any food sensitivity testing on your patients for children, or how did you figure out which foods to eliminate from their diet? Like IgG, IgE, versus doing like the prick tests and all of that.
We talked about that.
Oh, you do? Okay.
So the for the severely allergic kids and the one, and the first of all depends on insurance. Some people can't afford a lot of this testing because it's from integrative practitioners, and a lot of it's out of network, and they can run into some money. So you try to do whatever you can that's covered by insurance, so I don't bankrupt families, right? Because that's not my intention. If there's a kid with a life-threatening food allergy, I'll often send them to the allergist for the pin pricking test. If they're over a certain age, to see exactly what's going on, like kids who develop like anaphylaxis or severe allergies. So you can use that, and that is very helpful. There's also blood tests you can use from various labs. Western labs like Quest and LabCorp offer panels as well, both for IgE, the more severe life-threatening allergies, IgG, which is low-grade chronic inflammation, and some labs offer IgA, which you can look at in stool. The ones that are most common that cause low-grade chronic inflammation are IgG. What many kids are now having are a combination of IgE and IgG. So you can, however, if you can't afford it or you don't have an integrative doctor or you just don't know, what you do is the old-fashioned way, elimination diet. You remove the offending food. You have to wait about 4 weeks for that antibody to clear. It takes about 4 weeks to clear the antibody, IgG for example, and then you see how your kid does. If you want to give them a trial, you can give them a small amount of the food that you cleared, and they'll react quicker because once their body has cleared it, they are cleaner, and then they react quicker to it when you reintroduce it. Let's say it's gluten or dairy or soy or peanut or whatever you're suspecting, which are the most common allergens. So just by even doing a simple elimination without any fancy testing, you can test yourself at home.
And have you found after maybe months or years of eliminating that and their body's healed itself that they're able to reincorporate that, or do you think they should just eliminate it for life?
Depends on how sick they were to start with. If they were doing pretty well, you can probably reintroduce it later. If they were pretty sick, like they have, for example, ulcerative colitis, an autoimmune disease, or something else going on, it takes a lot longer. It's rare that I have a kid with a chronic disease that I don't do a lot more than just do a food elimination. If a kid just has some constipation or mild bloating, right? Not every kid has a life-threatening situation. Some of these issues are milder. You can clear them, clean up their diet, and then if you introduce it later, many of those kids can go on to tolerate it. So it really depends on the kid and what the underlying issues are.
This will likely be the last question here.
It's not really a question. I just wanted to say I understood that Trader Joe's has a commitment not to sell any GMO food. I'm sorry, what? As I understand, Trader Joe's has a commitment not to sell any GMO food. And their brand, just their brand. Yeah, any Trader Joe brand, yeah.
Yeah, so you said Trader Joe's has a commitment to not selling GMO foods, and apparently it's just when it's their brand that it's not GMO.
That's what
but again, I would
that could be more investigated, but it makes me feel already better to go in a store, and I know that from the start there is an attempt to not sell any of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, my own personal view is the more you can do local resourcing of food, the better off you are, especially if your local resource is organic and you're supporting local farming communities. There's a spillover effect and collateral effect that's really beneficial to that. But as we know, it's costly to do that, and we haven't figured out how to make that costly by subsidizing that system yet. It'd be great if we would. But I do think that it's important to remember that some of what these big chain stores are doing in organics, it's still better than non-organic, but it is production systems that aren't as good. They're not producing as good a food as the local sourced food in general. So, because some of it is coming from, for example, they're using, I know Earthbound uses a kind of growing that really is minimal nutrition in the food. So, because it's mass producing it. So.
All right, let's give them another round of applause.